So, for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Son of Godzilla. And in regards to the movie's overall production history, not much is really known about it, but from what little I could gather, this is essentially what led to the creation of the movie. During the 1960s, someone at Toho wanted to do another mismatched crossover that was in the same vein as King Kong vs. Godzilla, that idea being Batman vs. Godzilla. The movie itself would have featured the cast of the Adam West Batman TV show at the time, battling Godzilla using several Batman vehicles ranging from the Batmobile to the Batchopper. Not much is known about the story in terms of why Batman would fight Godzilla, but from what I could gather, it did introduce a concept that would be used in today's movie, which I'll get to later. And, not surprising, the concept never really got far enough for a full-fledged script to have been created. And with Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster being a moderate success at the box office, Toho decided to do yet another island adventure-themed Godzilla movie. But if you remember what I said in my review of Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, both Toho and Rankin Bass set aside their differences and worked together to make the second Toho King Kong film, King Kong Escapes. And why do I bring this particular detail up? The production team behind King Kong Escapes consisted of Ishiro Honda, Eiji Tsuburaya, along with Akira Ifukube, who all worked together on several of the past Godzilla movies, with the exception of Godzilla Raids Again along with Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, which meant that King Kong Escapes got essentially the A-team of filmmakers, while the Son of Godzilla essentially got the B team of filmmakers, which consisted of Jun Ifukuda, who directed Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, along with Masaru Sato, the composer from Godzilla Raids Again, and some other guy that did the special effects for Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, resulting in the movie that we're going to look at for today. And the Son of Godzilla has a rather mixed reaction within the Godzilla fan base, since it's one of those movies where you either love it or hate it kind of deal. Which leads me to my question for the movie. Will I like or hate the Son of Godzilla? As for the plot of the movie, a group of scientists, along with a nosy reporter, conduct a series of weather experiments on a tropical island. While conducting said experiments, a malfunction occurs, resulting in a series of radioactive storms, allowing smaller animals like praying mantises to grow to gigantic proportions. As the group of scientists, along with the reporter, try to survive on the island with the now gigantic praying mantises, the swarm of mantises in question soon come across a giant mound, unearthing an egg, allowing it to hatch, revealing a baby Godzilla. To make things even worse, Godzilla soon arrives in response to the cries of his newly born son. With the island now becoming monster-infested, can the group of men survive long enough to fight another day, get consumed by the monsters, or will they receive help from an unexpected ally? In terms of what I liked about the movie, despite the movie not having the likes of Eiji Tsuburaya or Akira Ifukube, I thought the special effects technician along with the composer they got for the film actually did a really good job with both the special effects and the soundtrack for the film, because the special effects, instead of being done by Eiji Tsuburaya, they were done by Sadama Akawa, and between the combination of the small-scale miniatures from the buildings, the trees, the map paintings, even the combination of the suits and puppets to portray the monsters in the movie, I thought were well done. Case in point, I think that the costume used to depict Godzilla in this movie looks pretty good in comparison to costumes that was used in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster sets. That costume looks less like Godzilla and more like a Muppet that was exposed to radiation. And with this costume, it definitely looks like Godzilla. Granted, I do have a problem with the overall design of the face, but other than that, I think the suit from the neck down looks great. I also like the method used to depict the new monsters that Godzilla fights in the movie, because several films before this, Godzilla, anytime he's fought another monster, is usually depicted in a man-in-suit creation, with the exception of Mothra, since that was done with a puppet. And with this movie, the monsters are depicted using puppets again, but I actually think that the puppets used to depict the monsters in this movie are fantastic. Like, this is probably some of the best puppetry I've seen in a Godzilla movie. Sure, the monsters, in terms of the concept behind them, is not the most unique thing ever. However, I do think that it is refreshing to see Godzilla fight against a monster that's depicted using puppets again as opposed to being a man-suit creation. I also like the fact that the technicals in the movie don't just extend to the puppets, but they also extend to like these gigantic life-size props of the two villainous monsters, regardless if it's like the tip of the claw from Kamacuras or one of Kumanga's legs. adding a sense of scale to both the humans and the monsters in the movie, and it doesn't just extend to the human characters interacting with these gigantic puppets. The movie also uses chroma key effects to also add to the sense of scale between the humans and monsters, since there are several points in time where we might have the human characters in the foreground while they look at a rear projection of the monsters battling it out, or we have some really ambitious wide shots where we have both the humans and the monsters interacting in the same environment. Granted, the chroma key effect itself has aged quite a bit, but the chroma key shots used in the movie are really ambitious and do their job. In regards to the movie's overall soundtrack, this is perhaps the strangest soundtrack there is within the franchise, because in comparison to a soundtrack that's done by Akira Ifukube, the type of soundtracks he makes for a usual Godzilla movie can range from either being really somber sounding, especially in the case with the first movie, to primarily becoming more militaristic, as heard in a good majority of the franchise. But with the soundtrack in this movie, it was done by Masahiro Sato, who provided a more whimsical soundtrack to the movie. And I know that sounds really odd, because if you were to listen to this movie by itself, it sounds like the type of background music that you would hear in an episode of Gilligan's Island. But strangely enough, the music heard here works well for the movie's advantage. There's even some jazz music thrown into the movie, providing a more creepy atmosphere when the more villainous monsters appear on screen. Also thought the movie had some really good consistent pacing from start to finish, and there's always something going on in the movie to keep the viewer entertained. And I actually do love the way the movie is set up, because in my opinion, I feel like this is what Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster should have been, because if you watch my review of Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, my biggest complaint was that Emperor was Godzilla's main opponent, and I stated that I think Emperor would have made for a better minor antagonist and then have Godzilla fight against some other big and horrific sea monster. They do exactly that with this movie, where we have Kamacuras, who is essentially the minor antagonist of the movie, while the monster that acts as the main villain of the whole movie is Kumanga. I also like the way Kumanga was foreshadowed in the movie, because in the first third, we have various characters walking through a jungle and you just see spiderwebs all over the place. And by the time we get to the second third of the movie, we have the group of scientists interacting with Reiko, and the scientists read journals that were by Reiko's father that constantly talk about Kumanga, and having Reiko reveal the sleeping grounds of Kumanga. Then the last third, we have Kumanga reawakened and going on a rampage for the remainder of the movie. Granted, the foreshadowing is very obvious, but it's done in a subtle way. I also like the fact that here's the first Godzilla film in a while to not have a humanoid villain, because between Godzilla vs. Mothra up to Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, all the films in between featured a human villain for the human aspect of the story, which is fine, and every single villain is completely different from one another, but I actually do find it refreshing that here's a movie where it doesn't have a humanoid villain, because it doesn't need one. Like, the closest we ever get to a human villain within the story is in the form of Furukawa, and even then, he's not evil by default. It's more he is just a regular guy, but through a series of circumstances revolve around him being cooped up on the island, along with being exposed to some type of tropical disease, he just goes crazy, becoming more of an obstacle to the main cast of characters as opposed to being an actual threat, which makes him less villainous and becomes more of a tragic character within the story. So, in short, he is just an unfortunate victim in the whole movie. I also like the way the movie goes about the man versus nature conflict, because the whole notion of man versus nature is nothing new. And with the Godzilla franchise, it's primarily been focused on mankind joining forces to battle against these giant monsters. And the idea of having a cast of characters being stranded on an island battling the elements, again, is nothing new, but the way the movie utilizes it here, I think is done in a refreshing way. Because on one hand, yes, you do have the main cast of characters trying to deal with the monsters, but they also have to deal with the unusual weather that they caused, cabin fever from being cooped up on the islands for a month or 3 months, depending on what kind of movie you watch, and the characters also suffer from jungle fever. And again, like I said, the whole notion of having a cast of characters being stranded on islands fighting the elements is nothing new, but you mix that with Godzilla, and it becomes becomes a unique entry within the franchise. Another aspect of the movie that I liked was the introduction of the weather towers, because here's this machine that's capable of controlling the weather, which I think is really cool. And then on top of that, the weather towers themselves tie back to the whole man versus nature concept. That not only do we have this device that was responsible for creating the radioactive storm and causing several problems for the main cast of characters, but it was also their primary solution for helping out the human characters. Also, this was the one concept that was originally introduced in the Batman vs. Godzilla script that I mentioned earlier in the review. I also like the fact that the monsters are given more of a personality in this movie than in the previous few movies, because when Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster started coming around, the monsters were given more humanistic qualities to them, but they were done in a subtle way. This year, it might be a step back for some people because Godzilla and some of these other giant monsters are just giant animals that are trying to rely on natural instinct, so having them rely on more like humanoid traits might be distracting, but they're still given a personality. Because there's this one entire sequence where you have Godzilla training his son in terms of how to roar at other monsters or fire his atomic breath, and it's done with no dialogue. And you can see through their body movements and facial expressions in terms of what the monster's feeling at that particular moment in time. And the personalities given to each monster themselves are very simplistic, but they get the point across. Because you have Baby Godzilla, who's essentially this gentle giant, who is also a big coward, while Godzilla is kind of this big, stern, father-like figure. I also really like the last third of this movie for two reasons. When you do have Godzilla and his son battling Kumanga, it takes place on a tropical island, but the thing I liked about it was, as the battle between the monsters progressed, you have the humans conducting the experiment again, allowing it to snow. And I think it's really cool to see a giant monster battle take place during a blizzard. Like, I've never seen a giant monster battle before and after this that takes place in a snowstorm. And when the battle does conclude, the ending is really unusual for a Godzilla movie, because if I had to describe it, basically Baby Godzilla is struggling to cope with the cold weather, and then Godzilla appears and starts hugging him, and then you see the two monsters kind of just hug each other, and then they just go into hibernation. And for a scene involving two guys wearing rubber lizard costumes, it's actually quite heartwarming, which is ridiculous, but it's true. As for the human characters in the movie, they're not the best human characters that's seen within a Godzilla movie, but they're passable and they do their job. Although if I actually did have to describe the characters, Maki Goro is this really determined news reporter who will do anything to get a good story. And in the first half of the movie, he's very childlike in the sense of how colorful his personality is. But in the second half of the movie, he does mature up and actually becomes more of a responsible adult. As for Professor Kasumi, he's a very determined scientist who will do anything to succeed in his weather experiment. However, he's the exact opposite of what Maki Goro was in the first half of the movie, because he's this really no-nonsense, level-headed scientist. But he does show a level of care to his other co-workers throughout the movie. As for the lead female character of Reiko, she is essentially this woman that's been surviving on the island for several years, and she's one of those characters that starts out really interesting because here's this independent woman that knows how to handle her environment. She sneaks around stealing stuff from Goro and the other scientists, and has a unique relationship with Baby Godzilla in that sense of she acts as a surrogate mother to Baby Godzilla. Until the second half of the movie, where she goes from being this independent woman to becoming more of this den mother for the scientists and becomes a damsel in distress. As for the rest of the support cast, other than Furukawa, the other scientists are just okay, in that sense of they're more important in the first half of the movie, but then kind of become less important as the movie progresses. Then you have the movie's overall message, and I have mixed feelings towards the message, because on one hand, I understand what the message is, I just don't think it's executed very well, because the movie director, Jun Fukuda, wanted to make a Godzilla movie that was aimed towards younger couples in the hopes that they would have a child of their own, and that's definitely shown in this movie through a combination of Goro and Reiko becoming close with one another, seeing them interacting with Baby Godzilla, along with seeing Godzilla taking care of his son. It's definitely there, I just don't think anybody understood that message, since a lot of people looked at the movie and thought the movie was aimed towards younger kids because it included a character like Baby Godzilla. So in short, the movie had a message, but I think a lot of people fail to see said message because of the premise. Then again, I kind of questioned the message, since I wasn't really too familiar with what the Japanese culture was like back in the 1960s in terms of how younger couples acted back in the day. So there's that. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, the first few problems I have with the movie are more nitpicks. The first one being the parts of the movie where certain scenes would go into slow-mo for 1 to 2 seconds for really no reason. It doesn't add anything to the story and felt really unnecessary on a technical level. Like, if the movie didn't have these random bits of slow-mo, nothing would be missed. Another nitpick I have of the movie has to do with this one particular scene in the sense of its timing. Like, literally. There are several points when you have the cast of main characters conducting the weather experiment for the first time, and it cuts back and forth between them working the various control units, and it cuts to an extreme close-up of this clock. And when you see this clock, you can clearly see what time it is and see the second hand moving as intended. Yet, anytime they cut to any of the wide shots where you have all the scientific characters wandering about operating the machinery and you see the clock in the background, you can still see what time it is, but the second hand is not functioning as intended. Then we cut to another extreme close-up shot of the same clock, and we see the second hand moving again. I don't know if I'm the only one that noticed this, but it was just more of a technical goof on the movie's part. Also, I don't know if it's just me, but does Godzilla have a thing for rocks? Because between Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster and this movie, Godzilla is almost guaranteed at some point to grab some rocks and toss them at the monster in which he's fighting. Because on one hand, I do think that it's kind of cool to see Godzilla using his environment to his advantage to fight the monsters, but can he use something else that isn't a rock? Another nitpick I had of the movie are the subtitles on my DVD copy of the movie, because there's several points in time where the subtitles appear 2 seconds later after a character starts to talk within the movie, but other than that, the subtitles still function as intended. And for the last of the nitpicks that I have with the movie, around the 20-minute mark, while the experiment is going wrong for the main cast of characters, there's just random narration for a few seconds, giving information to the audience in terms of what's going on within the movie at this particular point in time. And it's just one of those things where, like the random bits of slow-mo, the narration could have been taken out of the movie. Sure, it actually provides some important information, but I feel that you could have had one of the scientists during the aftermath of the storm explain what the weather conditions like, as opposed to having a narrator explain it, because that's the only point in time where there's any form of narration. In terms of the actual problems I have in the movie, I'm gonna start with the first 2 minutes before the credits, and I have 2 problems with this sequence altogether. And before I even go into the problems, I'm gonna give you the way the scene plays out. The movie begins on a dark and stormy night where we have this random airplane flying over some part of the Pacific Ocean. Then we cut to various shots of the crew of the airplane talk about how and why their instruments are malfunctioning. Godzilla shows up moments later, and then their equipment goes back to being normal again. Then they speculate the reason as to why their instruments malfunctioned in the first place, and Godzilla randomly appearing and heading towards a particular direction. First off, the dialogue is just all over the place because they toss out a bunch of crazy ideas, and I'm sitting there going, how do you know all of that? From speculating that the equipment is malfunctioning because of brainwaves, Godzilla's heading in the direction of said brainwaves. It's just like, you know this how? Second, that is the only time that group of characters show up in the entire movie. They don't ever appear in the rest of the movie. Because later, there's a point in time where we see an airplane drop off the main character, and that airplane had nothing to do with this airplane. Like, the way I would have rewritten this opening sequence, maybe have that airplane flying over the ocean, and then maybe have the crew on the airplane go, how's the passenger? He's napping at the moment. And then they just head in the same direction as the island. Then moments later, you see Godzilla rise up from the water, going in the same direction as the airplane, without the airplane crew knowing that Godzilla is following them. That's the way I would have made that scene more relevant. As it is, you could have cut that opening sequence out altogether and nothing would be missed. As for the next problems I have with the movie, all revolve around the monsters for several different reasons. The first reason being the lack of origins for some of the newer monsters. started with Kamakuras, since that's the first new monster we see in the movie. And when you first do meet Kamakuras, it starts out as this already giant-sized praying mantis that's roughly the same size as some of the human characters. And sometime during or after the failed weather experiment, the already giant-sized praying mantis becomes even more giant-sized as a result. And my big question is, why was the praying mantis already giant-sized to begin with? Like, it'd be one thing if the praying mantis start out being the same size as a regular praying mantis, then because of the weather experiment gone wrong, it mutates into becoming giant-sized. But as it is, it just doesn't really make much sense as to why there's already a giant-sized praying mantis that mutates it even further, becoming a much larger version of itself. As for the second new monster that we get introduced in the film, that being the Sony Godzilla himself, when we're first introduced to him, he first appears in an egg that a swarm of Kamakuras unearth and crack open. And I had so many questions going through my mind when I first saw this movie. The first one being, where's the Mrs. Godzilla? Second, is there a Mrs. Godzilla? Third, is this Godzilla that we've been following since Godzilla Raids Again up to this point female? Fourth, is Minya himself even a part of the same species? Because when you look at Minya in comparison to Godzilla, the two of them don't look anything alike. So, in short, we don't know where baby Godzilla even comes from. And as for the third and final monster that's introduced in the movie, Kumanga, or Ispaiga as it's pronounced in the English dub, we don't know where this thing even came from. Because on one hand, one could say, oh, maybe it was just a regular sized spider that was mutated by the same radioactive storm that mutated the giant praying mantis becoming Kamakuras, but that's not the case. Because throughout the movie, several characters learn that Kumanga has been on the island for some time. It was already giant-sized to begin with. And my question was, why was it giant-sized to begin with? Was it mutated by natural causes? Or is it some type of prehistoric species of giant spider? We just don't know. Another problem of the movie is the overall design to Godzilla's face, because as I said earlier, I think the Godzilla costume used in this movie is a huge improvement over the costume that was featured in the past few movies, with the exception of the face, because when you look at the face, it doesn't really match the body, and doesn't even look like a traditional Godzilla head. Because Godzilla's head is always modeled after a T-Rex, yet Godzilla's head in this movie looks less like a dinosaur, more like a toad crossed with a cancerous tumor, as many other people have said before. Another problem of the movie is the overall concept behind the villainous monsters that Godzilla fights in this movie, because when you contrast this with Godzilla's main opponent from Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, Ibara might not look all that inspiring, but here's the thing, I've never seen a crustacean-themed kaiju before. With a combination of Kamakuras and Kumanga in this movie, let's actually look at the two back-to-back, shall we? Kamakuras is just a giant praying mantis, and this isn't the first time I've seen a giant praying mantis-themed monster. As seen in a movie like The Deadly Mantis, a movie about a giant praying mantis. With Kumanga, on the other hand, it's just a giant spider. And like Kamakuras before it, this isn't the first time I've seen a giant spider-themed monster. As seen in a movie like Tarantula, a movie about a giant spider. Sure, the way they're depicted in this movie is definitely a huge improvement in terms of how giant mantis and spider-themed monsters have been depicted before, but the idea in pen and paper seems very generic. In a been there, done that kind of way. The last few problems I have with the movie all revolve around baby Godzilla himself. The first reason being, when anybody goes to watch a Godzilla movie, they want to see Godzilla either destroying buildings or fighting other monsters. No one really wants to go see a Godzilla movie in which he adopts a son, because the whole draw of the franchise is seeing a giant monster battle another giant monster. Second, baby Godzilla himself is both really annoying and useless, in that sense of he's the main form of comical relief in the movie, and on top of that, he actually causes several problems for the main cast of characters. For example, there's this one point in time where he attempts to fight Kamakuras, but in doing so, he accidentally awakens Kumanga. And most of the time, he becomes the damsel in distress, where he would get overpowered by the new monster, and Godzilla would come in to save him and fight off the other monster. Second, I feel that the premise to this movie could have been a lot better. Like, instead of having the baby Godzilla character being the main draw of the movie, would it have been a lot cooler if the group of scientists conducted their experiment and went horribly wrong in one of two things occurred. It mutates smaller animals into becoming giant size, like Kamakuras and Kumanga, while it also reawakens some prehistoric monsters like another Anguirus, Grosaurus, and then Godzilla goes to the island because of the amount of radiation produced by the radioactive storm. Then you see Godzilla battling all the other monsters for dominance of the island, while trying to have the main cast of characters trying to survive on the island while Godzilla's battling the monsters. I think that would have been a much cooler premise than what we got. As for my third and final critique that I have revolved around Baby Godzilla, it's the reception that the movie gets because of him. From the very few Godzilla reviews that I've seen, it feels like everybody hates this movie because of Baby Godzilla. Sure, I don't like Baby Godzilla myself. As I said earlier, he's annoying, useless, and an unnecessary addition to the franchise. But just because he's my least favorite part of the movie, I don't think the movie around him is bad. I actually think it's quite good. That's like having a ton of people doing a review of Moana where the reviews went among the lines of this: here's my review of Moana. I really hate that chicken because he's an unnecessary addition to the movie and he's annoying. And because of this, I think the movie sucks. That's how I feel about the reception that this movie gets, because it does feel like a lot of people do hate this movie because of Baby Godzilla himself. So, for my final verdict of Son of Godzilla, although I'm not the biggest fan of the Son of Godzilla himself, I love the movie around him. Like, if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, imagine watching an episode of Gilligan's Island, where Godzilla was like a recurring character, and you basically get the same idea here. Although the movie's not necessarily a masterpiece by no means, I actually enjoyed this movie more than most of the early era Godzilla installments, because I find the movie to be just this really relaxing experience in a lazy Sunday kind of viewing. And as far as the story and characters are concerned, that's really refreshing. Now, granted, your enjoyment of the film really does depend on how well you can tolerate the Son of Godzilla himself. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of the character, as I said earlier, I like the movie around him. So, overall, much like Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, the movie isn't quintessential, but I do think that the movie is harmlessly entertaining. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Son of Godzilla? Looks like the movie got generally mixed and negative reception. Honestly, I don't think the movie's that bad. And so, for my final rating of Son of Godzilla, I give it a 4 out of 5. And before you even say anything, I know what you're thinking. You give the likes of Godzilla vs. Mothra and Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, a measly 3.5 out of 5, while this gets a 4 out of 5? I know. Blasphemous. But hey, I like the movie. But anywho, what's your favorite survival movie? And see you later.